As a land-grant institution, we would like to acknowledge that the Utah State University campuses and centers reside on and operate on the territories of the 8 tribes of Utah. The Logan campus is situated in the Sahivagoy Valley, or Willow Valley, the ancestral lands of the northwestern band of the Shoshone Nation, where Shoshone people have stewarded the land since time immemorial and continue to live today. We acknowledge these lands carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. We affirm Indigenous self-governance, history, experience, and the resiliency of the Native peoples who are still here today. Now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Van to introduce our speaker.
Thanks. Hi everyone, I'm Van Clark. I am the student president for student chapter of the American Planning Association here at USU. And we are thrilled today to have Angela Brooks here as our designated Woman in Landscape Architecture and Planning, or WILA, speaker. A few of us had the opportunity to hear from her earlier today during our WILA panel, or yesterday afternoon as she passed through some of our studio classes, and we're looking forward to hearing more in just a few minutes. But before we get to that, Angela earned her Bachelor's of Urban Studies from Jackson State University, where she became a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority, the first intercollegiate African-American sorority. She went on to study a Master's of Urban and Regional Planning from the University of New Orleans and has been involved in the American Planning Association since her college days. Since then, Angela has chaired APA's Housing and Community Development Division, served as a director in the APA board, been a vice president of programs for the Planning and Black Community Division, and co-chaired the update to APA's official housing policy guide. For the past 2 years, Angela has served as the first Black female president of the American Planning Association, as well as continuing her position as the director for the Illinois office of the Corporation for Supportive Housing, a national nonprofit. In her own words from our panel this afternoon, she's effectively working 2 full-time jobs. It's evident from this list, though by no means exhaustive, the amazing qualities Angela possesses of hard work and diligence. But personally, I'm even more amazed by what I've seen, even in my brief interactions with her, of care, leadership, and friendliness. When I reached out to Angela to invite her in July, she replied to my email in less than 6 hours, which genuinely I don't think I've ever done in my life. In her busy schedule, she responded with enthusiasm to speak and work with student groups, paying back her service to APA tenfold. Since then, her passion for APA and the service she gives has been palpable, and I cannot wait to see how that translates into her work in housing and social action. We are so incredibly privileged to have Angela Brooks with her today, so please welcome me in joining her.
Wow, Van, I hope I can get that recorded and send it to my dad, so you know. My dad would describe me as somebody who's crazy and doesn't say no, so thank you for that amazing introduction. It's probably one of the best ones I've had in the last 2 years, so thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Okay, so let's just give you a background. Well, we're going to get to my first slide. This is who I am. So let me go through the list of who I am, and this will help you, and then I'll try this again. So I always like to level set, and I think it's very important when I'm speaking to bring my full self into speaking and presentations and let you know a little bit about me along the way, and then you can kind of understand the lens in which I come to everything in which I do. So, you know my name. I'm Angela Brooks. I am the daughter of Albert and Mary. They had really big afros in the 70s, you know. But if you can get past the hair, that's me down there. I'm the big sister to Zach, who is 17 years younger than me, so whole nother story for maybe later. I was born and raised in Seattle, and I'm a proud alum of Seattle Public Schools. You heard I am alum of Jackson State University in Jackson, Mississippi, the college that accepted me despite my leaving high school with a 2.0 GPA. And I have to note that because, you know, I wouldn't have gotten in here with a 2.0 GPA. So, you know, I went to University of New Orleans, which is where I got my planning degree. And is the home of my great-grandparents, so I felt a connectivity to that university for that reason. I'm a kidney donor to Nakia. That's one of my sorority sisters there in the picture. all of these things really help shape how I come to the work that I do today and how I lead the organization, which is the largest planning organization in the world. And something I did not put on my bingo card when I was sitting in chairs like you in graduate school and a member of APA definitely was not on my bingo card. Actually wasn't on my bingo card 5 years ago. So I just like to start that with who I am. I grew up in Seattle in a very, very Black interactive church. For any of you ever been to a Black church service? Okay, well then, if you have, you know we have to do this again. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Exactly. That's what I'm looking for. So with that said, well, you know what, before we go to that, let's go back a little bit. So early in my career, I think it's important to tell the story on how I became a houser. When I was in graduate school, I thought I'd be, by the time I was 40, my goal was to be the planning director of a very large city. I was like, you know, I'm gonna go be the planning director, maybe of my hometown, Seattle, maybe New Orleans. I didn't know, but I knew I'd be a planning director. And I've probably worked as a traditional planner maybe 1 or 2 years of my career. And 2 things kind of happened in graduate school, but one that really changed the trajectory of where my career would go. I mentioned I graduated from high school at a 2.0. I am a notorious underachiever when it comes to academics. So I found myself in graduate school about to get put out, so my dad cut me off. And so I had to get a job. And my job was as a probation parole officer. And it's the most random job you can ever have when you're a planning student, probably even in graduate school at all. It's probably not a good decision. But nevertheless, I had a situation where I had a client who had come into the office and I was gonna have to detain her. Translation, I was gonna have to arrest her. And she had brought her daughter with her. And so my boss gave me 2 choices. I could call Child Protective Services and have her get whatever happens there. Or if somebody was at her home, I could take her home. So I chose to take her home. And at the time, I don't know much about New Orleans. I hadn't been there very long. And I took her home and she lived in the public housing development right adjacent to the French Quarter, which up until that moment, and I was only 21, so I was at the French Quarter quite often. So up until that moment, I thought that facility was vacant because that's how deteriorated the housing was. And it broke my heart to leave a 7-year-old child in housing that looked like that. And I was like, hey, I'm aspiring to be in the built environment. I'm gonna probably work for a government agency, and here's government housing that looks like crap, and I wouldn't want an animal, let alone a human, to live into it. And that really changed the trajectory of my career and how I got interested in working in housing. And I tell this story a lot because I say that to students particularly. You might have a path figured out right now, but it might change, and that's still okay. And I'm lucky to have found something I'm very passionate about and has led to a lot of the work that I am doing currently. And so normally, I forgot to put the slide in, there would be a slide that says housing is a human right, and that is a tenet I wholeheartedly believe in. I believe that every human being deserves to have a safe, affordable place, not only to live, but also to thrive. And I've spent my career really working on the thriving part. And so a lot of the work that I know you guys are doing, because I've been into your studios and I've seen a lot of your work on the walls, I know a lot of the things that you are doing kind of talk to that. So today I'm going to stand here and talk to you a little bit about a place that's really significant to all of us. It's probably the first place where most of you learned most things in life, the first place you received love, and the place that you probably feel the most comfortable. And there's no place like home is kind of the place where I like to start my presentations. It's also partly because I'm a huge Wizard of Oz fans, and Wicked comes out today. And so it felt like a very good fitting. I would have had on red shoes, but they don't match. But you know, for me, home is way more than a physical structure. It's the place you get nurtured. It's the place that you find love. It's the place that your values are raised, if you're lucky. Not everybody is lucky enough to experience that. And I'm going to talk a lot about that today. You know, for some people, home is really still just a fairy tale, and the lack of affordable housing is rising globally. Over the last 2 years, I've traveled to 6 countries. I've spoken across the country, and every place I've spoken, affordable housing always rises to the top of the issues that we speak about. Families are currently spending an exorbitant amount of money for housing. I'm sure many of you are as well. And so in the space that I work, we usually, and well, it's probably what most people should use, is you shouldn't be spending more than 30% of your income on rent or on housing and utilities. And in very many parts of the country, people are spending up to 50% of that. And so one of the big impacts of a lot of that are just some of the historical things that have created that. And so this here is a map. I chose Ogden, Utah. They didn't have Logan. And, you know, this is the 1940s map of Ogden from the Homeowners Loan Association Corporation. And I'll give a little history about that to kind of frame why it's there. So in the 1930s, city assessors that were supported by the federal government under the New Deal rated more than 200 city neighborhoods. The ratings were based on how good of investment they would be for banks and real estate developers. So an A meant the best investment, D meant the investment was hazardous. And I'm sure it's no surprise to many of you that this helped shape the future social and economic and environmental kind of life in these places. And these red line maps are found in the University of Richmond's Mapping Inequality Project. So that's where I got that. If you're a nerd and you want to see it, it's down there on the bottom. And you guys have the slides, you can get the link. And I'm just going to read you a few things that are said on this particular map. So A1, which is to the right over there. And some of you probably know Ogden, so you can tell me if it's still very similar to this. This was from the 40s. This is the exclusive residential section of Ogden, including Oak Crest Park subdivision. Practically all of the houses in this area are of the larger modern structures. Most of them have been built since 1924. This area is protected by zoning restriction and contains no commercial enterprises of any kind. The section is situated at the foot of the Wasatch, you guys know how to say it, mountains, there you go, and it's of eminence which affords excellent views of all parts of the mountains, the city, and across the valley to the Great Salt Lake. This section is virtually free from the smoke nuisance which aggravates other portions of the city. The leading and more affluent business and professional people reside in this area. Now let's switch on over to D7. This area is inhabited by foreigners, including Italians, Mexicans, and some Negroes. Their words, not mine. It is the warehouse and industrial part of the city. Houses therein are poor. Any further manufacturing or industrial development in the city will be in this section. Or D1, this is the oldest residential part of the city wherein the security is very poor. The western one half of this area, immediately east of the railroad yards, contains most of Ogden's meager colored population, also a sprinkling of other foreign elements, such as Mexicans and Italians. D4, this is sparsely settled section. Most of it includes Sullivan Hollow. The security in this area is poor. Workers, including those who make a living from their modest acreage, live in this section. And I always like to frame my conversations around equality and zoning to kind of set the stage on where we started, because in many jurisdictions, zoning codes haven't been updated that much since then. And so for decades, zoning really has been used to restrict access to opportunity, and outdated and inequitable zoning regulations in far too many places are choking our housing supply. So the New York Times in 2019 did a huge study on single-family zoning. In the United States, over 75% of residential land is zoned for single-family housing. And so I'm sure many of you, you're in school, so you probably look at data and demographics way more than I do. So you can look at population projections and you can probably figure out we can't continue on that type of model of housing and successfully house people. And so we've got to start thinking about how do we increase housing diversity throughout our communities that really allow an opportunity for everyone who wants to reside in a community to live there. And as a nation, we are short about 4 million units nationwide. And so this is a map. I haven't updated my presentation because they just released their 2024 report. So this is the Housing Under Production report that APA sponsors every year with Up for Growth, which indicates kind of where we are as a nation in our underproduction. Underproduction increased nearly 3% since 2022, according to Up for Growth. We need to remember this isn't just a coastal problem, and it's not just an urban problem, because very often we obviously think about the coast. We know it's ridiculous and we know it's overpriced, but housing underproduction increased by about 5% in the suburbs, and the shortage is really spreading geographically. And small towns and suburban communities are starting to be impacted as well. In small towns, housing underproduction increased by about 48%. And it's really due to a sudden drop in unit delivery, and there's a whole lot of variety of factors in that I'm sure all of you are very aware of around supply chain. And in 2022, the Up for Growth underproduction report showed here in Utah, you were underproduced about 55,000 units. And in 2023, that increased to 61,000 units. The National Low-Income Housing Coalition shows that Utah has a shortage of almost 44,000 units for affordable housing needs, which really is showing that renters are severely cost burdened. 75% of the renters here are severely cost burdened, which goes back to the figure I said earlier, that you shouldn't be paying more than 30% of your income on both housing and utilities. And so what does this really mean to a room full of built environment professionals? It means we've got a lot of work to do. And so the Pew Charitable Trust has been doing a lot of research in this area, and in this survey they recently found there's a widespread support for the types of policies that states, cities, and towns have to start considering to increase housing supply. There's pretty little division between state, region, and whether residents live in rural or suburban or city communities on these issues. This slide is really just some of their findings, and this has been a very eye-opening kind of thing for me over the last 2 years, because I live in Chicago, where it's reasonably affordable for a northern city, but I'm from Seattle, which I couldn't afford to breathe in if I wanted to, let alone buy a house. And so, we're starting to see some incredible work by planning departments throughout the country to really start addressing some of this. And planning has had some shady history, which I kind of started with, and the history of regulations like zoning to really restrict access to opportunities. And we've got to start thinking about how do we address equity lens in a lot of the work that we do. And so we have to recognize in many communities that your zip code really does determine the trajectory of your life, health-wise, opportunity-wise, from school to, I live on the south side of Chicago. And I certainly recognize my privilege in that I choose to live there, my neighbors do not. And I definitely see every single day the tale of two cities. I don't have a grocery store near me, so I'm in a food desert. The streetlights sometimes work. The park across the street, I live right across the street from Olmsted Park, which is the same person who certainly developed city. Other parks in the city, Grant Park, most of you are probably familiar with most famous park being Central Park, and our park is underutilized, undersupported, and certainly not maintained in the way that it should be. And so recognizing that a lot of the work that I am doing is around talking about equity and the types of things we're doing. And one of the things I have to appreciate is the work that states are starting to do to address zoning reform. And I always pick up a paper, and so I picked up yesterday's Utah Dispatch, and there's a really good article there outlining the 2025 legislative session here in Utah and the work that your state legislators are going to be doing around a statewide housing plan to really address providing more housing opportunities throughout the state of Utah, which is starting to see, as I'm sure all of you are familiar, a tremendous growth and increase of lack of affordable housing. And so since I've been kind of doom and gloom, I want to talk about some of the resources, because I am president of the American Planning Association, so you should anticipate some level of a commercial. This is our Equity and Planning Guide, which is probably one of the policy guides I'm most proud about that came out. Not that I wrote any of it, but it came out while I was president, so I'm going to claim it. We've got a bunch of policy guides. You should check them all out. Some are more nerdy. Some are actually really, really useful. This is one of them, and it's useful not just to those of you who are built environment professionals or aspiring professionals, but it's also useful for community residents. One of the things we didn't mention in my bio is I'm also, and this is by far the dumbest decision I've made in a while, I'm a commissioner on the Chicago Board of Zoning Appeals. It's the most painful thing I've ever done in my life. Our hearings are at least 9 hours, but often 14. So when I talk about zoning reform, I'm talking about it to increase housing, but I'm also talking about let's be more efficient. I can assure you there's nothing you could be building next door to my house that I care enough about that I'm going to sit in a meeting for 14 hours to tell you why I don't like it. There's just not. And so it's the exact opposite of community engagement, and it's an example of the types of archaic practices we've kept because we wrote them 50 years ago, and it's not how we live today. It's not how we engage today. And it's not the way we have to do it. So the thing I like about this policy guide is it talks about equity and zoning. It actually talks about and well, I guess in some states we probably can't even call it that anymore, but it talks about how we can really look at how zoning has disproportionately impacted some communities and how we get out of that. And it gives real strategies to do so. So I encourage you to check that out as one of the tools that kind of think about. And for those of you who are more landscape architects, it actually talks about some of that too, and how we design better spaces for communities to both live, work, and play. These are some of the land use reforms that are outlined in there. I don't think it's going to be any surprise to any of you about what these actions might be. I already talked about single-family zoning, and I have to always clarify that I'm not saying you can't build a single-family house, but what I am saying that in a single-family zone, you might also want to consider a duplex, a triplex, or a fourplex. And I am a recovering real estate developer. And so one thing I often have to tell people is I can assure you when we're developing housing, we are not going to build something we cannot rent or sell. So to a certain degree, let the market kind of decide, and you give incentives to get the types of housing you want, i.e. affordable. ADUs are a huge, huge, huge thing across the country right now for a wide variety of reasons. Transit-oriented development, I'm sure all of you think a lot about. It's really important to start thinking about minimum lot sizes and reducing some of those barriers. Height restrictions, it's very interesting when you sit on a zoning board. That's one of the hot items, so it's definitely a hot that and parking are probably the hot ticket items in a lot of these things, but they're the types of things we have to, as built environment professionals, start thinking about when we want to start talking about creating communities that have opportunities for everybody who desires to live there to do so. So one of the things we've been doing at APA for the last 2 years is the Housing Supply Accelerator. It has been a really amazing experience. As somebody who spent my career on the government side until recently, a lot of times when you're working on the government side as a planner or an architect or whatever, you don't think about the political ramifications of things. So the Housing Supply Accelerator was a bunch of planners, a bunch of elected leaders, but we also had the mortgage makers. We had the home builders, we had the National Association of Realtors, and I will tell you in my almost 30 years of working, we're almost never on the same page. So it was cool to be in the same room working on the same goal of how do we increase housing supply in our communities, and having some of the very, very tough conversations, translation fights, about what are some solutions that could work. And so I will have to shout out, is anybody here from Clearfield, Utah? All right, well, your mayor, he sat on this. So Mark had some really great contributions as both an elected leader and also a realtor about the types of things and challenges in his smaller community, because we also had the planning director of LA. So it was really important that we had both large and small urban and rural communities on this particular panel. So in May, we released our playbook, and these are kind of the goals of the playbook. We look to improve local capacity, identifying solutions, how do we speed up reforms, and how do we really realign the efforts of public and private stakeholders. Wait, here's a QR code. So for those of you who are interested, you can scan this QR code. I encourage you to do so. But it really is a model on housing supply and zoning reform changes are certainly not a one-size-fits-all solution. And so one of the things that I love about this playbook, and yes, this is a commercial in case you weren't clear, one of the things I love about the playbook is there are case studies from both large and small cities of what other jurisdictions and what other states are doing that are really moving the needle. For instance, there's examples like Omaha, Nebraska. They have a public-private partnership on leveraging multiple layers of funding that both do home ownership, rental, and new build and preservation, which is kind of cool. There's Fayetteville, Arkansas has permit-ready building design program, and so they essentially put turnkey architectural designs in the hands of residential construction developers who want to build in the communities downtown in their Wicker Park neighborhood. Memphis 3.0, it's their comprehensive plan, and the thing that's most exciting about that comp plan, because if any of you have ever worked on a comp plan or those evaluated one, very often we have some really great planning theory, but we don't go update our building code. And so sometimes there's not an alignment between the plans and the zoning and the building code. So Memphis did a full key overhaul look at both and updated both at the same time. And so it's a really good example of how we apply both good planning and working with the other entities in our cities to make sure we are making plans that actually work. And so it included applying the residential code to 3 and 6 unit structures and removing the sprinkler requirement for buildings that have 2-hour fire rated walls and floor to ceiling assemblies. And I had to read that because that's not my bailiwick, so I'm not going to, and I know a lot of you, it is yours, so I want to make sure I had that correct. And so, this has been really important and a very good example that we put in here to really highlight what other communities could be doing to really move the needle to increase their housing supply. And then in my home city, or my new home state of Harvey, Illinois. Harvey, Illinois is just south of Chicago. It's an underserved community that has a history of storm-related infrastructure challenges. So they're an example in the playbook of how they have really dealt with reoccurring issues of flooding and past storm events, and they're using FEMA funding for disaster relief to implement a new nature-based solution. And they constructed a 23-acre-foot stormwater detention basin equipped with native wetland plants and additional storm sewers. And it really is looking at mitigating future flooding and protect more than 100 structures. Harvey is a very, very, very underinvested in community, and so a lot of the residents, it is primarily home ownership, but it's a bunch of folks who don't have a whole lot of extra money every time they were getting flooded and damaged. And I'm sure all of you, if any of you are following, I'm guessing as a bunch of landscape architect and environmental planners you are, insurance is a big issue, particularly when you're areas that aren't in floodplains, and they were continuing to be hit. So it was really causing a lot of dilapidated housing in their community. So it was really exciting to have that as a case study of how they're moving forward. So we start talking about housing pipelines. And so I talked a little bit about Fayetteville and Omaha. And here is the ADU plans gallery that they created in California to help move the needle on creating ADUs. ADUs get very controversial. I actually am never 100% sure why, because it just seems like low-hanging fruit since the vast majority of the people won't be able to see them. But nevertheless, these are just some pictures that kind of go with that kind of supply of that. And then the bulk of what I've been doing is really talking about zoning reform. And since I'm from Washington State, I'm always going to pick a Washington State example. And Walla Walla, Washington is in, I call it Eastern Washington. I would imagine some might say Central Washington, depending on how they look at it. In 2018, they adopted ADU regulations that really have been transforming how their city looks. It's a rural town. They've got about 35,000 residents, and they saw housing prices jump in just 5 years from about $300,000 to $489,000, and rents increased by about $300 in that same time frame. And so the planning department did a significant amount of outreach in 2017. They knew where they were going to go. And one of the things they did was they went in communities and they showed pictures of what already exists that they were going to be proposing. And so here you have an example of an ADU. This is a multifamily building that, depending on how you look at it, you may not even realize it. And so they wanted to show the community the types of things that already exist in their community that they were going to be proposing to help address some of their housing supply needs, to really address how expensive it was becoming to live in Walla Walla. And as somebody who grew up in Seattle, I always used to think, I was kind of shocked when I was reading this, because I always think of Walla Walla as for two things. It's where the state prison was, and it's where you get your onions. And so to know that their price was jumping so high, it was really kind of alarming. So I picked that one for that reason. And yes, I'm acknowledging my city bias. Yes, I was a city snob. Saying that I picked it anyway. And so here's Eagle, Colorado, population about 7,500. I'm sure it's very similar to many communities near here, facing some of the vast majority of workforce housing challenges. So they went out to coffee shops and barber shops and all the places people congregate to really start working on their housing needs assessment. And they came up with Recode Eagle, and this is where they did revisions to the town's land use and development code, which included by right options. They set an AMI standard that they wanted to create housing for. They created a land donation program for acquisition and a land banking program. And they established a density bonus, and they started to allow accessory dwelling units. And so after several years of study and engagement, the city of Grand Rapids adopted their new zoning ordinance, and they did a reconfiguration of collapsed zoning districts from multiple residential and commercial zones and combined them into 3 neighborhood classifications. And they simplified the list of zone districts. If any of you have ever suffered through a zoning code and zoning districts, it's obnoxiously obtruse, very hard to read, and you probably need a law degree, not even just a planning degree, to get through it. And so they really looked at how they could minimize their zoning code to make it easier to use and easier to implement. And so they shrank from 7 residential zoning districts to 2, and they still offered a wide variety of housing types through those zoning districts to really increase their housing supply. And their zoning code also provides incentive-based policies such as minimum lot area reductions in exchange for meeting some of their housing goals. And so again, like I said, incentivizing types of housing diversity that they wanted. And they really focused on accessory units, accessible units, and mixed income housing. And so the Michigan chapter of APA then created a housing supply toolkit for zoning reform and code writing, which is a really great guide for communities looking at doing so, that really highlighted some of the work of Grand Rapids. And this toolkit also includes 15 tips and tools to expand housing supply and choice through zoning reform. And so it was really great to see a state chapter, they did it before we did nationally, taking the charge on really addressing and giving tools to other jurisdictions on their zoning reform journey, because it's not easy by any stretch of the imagination. And then as we start thinking about increasing housing, we've got to start thinking about adaptive reuse. I'm sure all of you are thinking a lot about where you might live when you graduate. Some of you are looking at very expensive cities. And so one of the things that we've got to start thinking about is not just new construction. The supply chain issues are going to continue to probably be trash for the next few years. So, it's going to be slower on getting materials and getting them at a cost that's not going to be prohibitive to increasing at least affordable and middle income housing. And so adaptive reuse really does increase the use of housing opportunities by converting underused buildings. When I start looking at downtown conversions in Chicago, it's really exciting to start seeing the needle, because like many places with hybrid work schedule, we've got a lot of vacancies, commercial vacancies that are all-time high. And so starting to see buildings flip from commercial to residential. And so one of the things that happened last year, the Biden administration announced new actions to support and accelerate commercial to residential development and conversions through federal guidance on financing and tax incentives and technical assistance and the reuse of federal properties. This again goes to some of our theoretical ideas not catching up with the practicality. There are still many building codes that don't make that easy to do. And so when we start looking at how we increase adaptive reuse, we have to look at all of the entitlement requirements that are used that could be preventative measures on making something that seems pretty easy much more unattainable. So now my favorite topic, parking. And so if you ever want to go to a hearing on when people are going to get rowdy, come to one where we're talking about reducing parking requirements, including in a city like Chicago that has very, very, very good public transportation. And so Doug Shoup did a book, The High Cost of Free Parking, which basically talks about we have way too many parking spots in this country. In fact, what's the number? I think the U.S. has set aside 2 billion parking spaces for just 250 million cars, which basically translates we have more space to house cars than people. And so as we start thinking about how we can look at increasing housing or barriers to housing, we have to start thinking about parking. So as a recovering developer, parking adds costs. So right now in Chicago, my last real estate deal was coming in for an affordable deal at about $500,000 per unit, which, do the math, that's nothing affordable about that. So the subsidy is really, really high. But parking spots come in at about $5,000 for a surface level, and if you're doing a garage, about $50,000 or more. And so when you start thinking about it from a per unit cost, do the math. And so we've got to start thinking about what parking makes sense for our communities. And so certainly in Chicago, next to a train station, maybe you don't need one-for-one, well, you definitely don't need one-for-one parking. And so starting to look at what code revisions make sense for that. And that's not just for large cities. Sandpoint, Idaho, I think, did I meet somebody here who's from Sandpoint? It came up somewhere. Anyway, Sandpoint, Idaho has under 9,000 residents. And so they started looking at their parking requirements because they were building a bank, or actually rehabbing a bank in their downtown. And the rehab would have required them to create a parking lot for 200 parking spots, 1 block from an existing city parking lot. And so this made them start thinking about what they might need and how they might change. They eliminated parking minimums in their downtown entirely. They significantly reduced minimums for commercial and residential properties elsewhere in the city, and they instituted parking maximums. And so zoning reforms really aren't just for large cities. Sandpoint is a great example of a smaller community that's taking some pretty big action to reflect the way we are living today. And so a lot of the things that we've got to do as built environment professions is really reframe how we talk about these things. Some of the jargon, I have basically 2 degrees in planning, and sometimes I sit in ZBA meetings and our attorneys are talking and I can't follow along, so we certainly can't expect that our residents should. And so a lot of words have negative connotation. Density has an automatic negative connotation. And so we've got to start thinking about how we can reframe some of our zoning conversations. So I encourage people to say messages like, we can highlight the positive benefits by more housing in our communities that benefit everybody. We can talk about single-family zoning only as limiting housing choices. We can talk about how it often elevates prices, which is a fact. We can also talk about how it segregates cities from the have and the have-nots. So when we frame it, say things like, we're going to create housing of all shapes and sizes so a wider variety of people can live here. We can talk about how it can increase housing ownership and availability. It was kind of cool seeing some of your tiny home studies upstairs and like who might live there and how that can increase the affordability because it's smaller, and thinking about how we can increase the types of housing in our communities. And so messages that often have worked in my hearings are, your young adult children might be able to move back here when they graduate from college, which should be on the top of all of your minds. Or it's top of my mind right now, dealing with an aging father. When you retire and you want to sell your house, there might be a housing option available for you in the community that you live. Because 9 times out of 10, there's not going to be a single family house accessible to them climbing stairs, but a condo, which they don't currently have in my dad's neighborhood, would be an amazing opportunity for him to stay in the same community. And so when you're having these conversations about the types of housing you're creating, just think about creative ways to think about how it's inclusive for people who might find issues. And when we start talking about housing supply, these are the benefits of what housing supply can benefit. It slows rent growth. It reduces the competition for available homes. There are some really competitive markets out there right now. My friends just sold their house for, I think they got $50,000 over asking, which is pretty amazing for them, but probably not for me if I were buying the house, because I wouldn't have been able to get that. And it really lowers the displacement issues that we're seeing in a lot of markets. And so whenever we start talking about zoning reform, I always have to talk about Minneapolis. And Minneapolis mainly because Minneapolis has been the one that's gotten the most publicity, but also because it's one that has worked. And so Minneapolis considered a national leader in addressing housing crisis, and their reforms of the last few years really have been filling missing middle housing. They basically allowed duplexes and triplexes in areas where only single-family zoning was allowed before. And the changes and others really have helped Minneapolis expand their housing option faster than other Midwestern cities. They increased their housing supply by 12%, whereas it only increased by 4% in the rest of the state. Rents grew by only 1%, whereas rents grew elsewhere in the state by up to 14%. Homelessness decreased by 12%, where the rest of the state saw an increase of about 12%. And so Minneapolis is a great example of where it's working. Montana and the Montana Miracle is also another good example where basically the state of Montana, and I am by no stretch of the imagination saying statewide preemption is the way to go, so I always have to clarify that so I don't get run out of rooms. But they did basically say that up to a fourplex can go into any single family zone throughout the state. Cities over, I think, 4,000. So they're starting to see even cities like Lewiston Montana are starting to implement that and really create more housing options for a state that's seeing really big industrial growth and not able to provide housing to accommodate the economic development that is coming. Minneapolis is a great example, but it also was a fight. And so a small group of NIMBY organizations sued, and they basically used a 1976 environmental law to their advantage. And so similarly to how we need to update some of our zoning laws, some of our environmental laws don't fit in either. Like the environmental law for a project makes sense, but maybe not for a huge comprehensive plan. That's what they sued for. And the state legislature last year voted to protect comp plans that advance local housing reform from out-of-context environmental lawsuits. So that happened in May. And so basically the comp plan clarity bill means Minneapolis can resume the implementation of their plan. Doesn't mean that each individual project doesn't go through it, but the plan itself does not. And so I like to close out with kind of calls of actions, particularly when I have a room full of built environment professionals. And so it's really clear that our communities are facing some amazing challenges that really require urgent attention. And the crisis right now is housing. And so the issue threatens the heart of our diverse communities and our vibrant cities. And it's not just an economic problem, it's a humanitarian one. I'm sure many of you don't like seeing your neighbors sitting and sleeping on streets. You don't like seeing our elders not having anywhere to go and being forced to move out of our communities. And so there are things we can really do to ensure that our cities are accessible to all. And so with cities becoming increasingly inaccessible to a broad swath of residents in our populations, I call on you to use your expertise, your innovation, your insight, and your vision to really create and revolutionize housing options for all. Incorporate affordable housing in your master plans. It was great sitting in the studio today, seeing a lot of the work that you guys are doing, albeit it's a whole nother world away. Really looking at housing, incorporating affordable housing into new developments. And where possible, missing middle, but also low-income families. This really does, it cultivates inclusive communities that really allow all of us to thrive and to benefit. And many of you will be working on master plans in the very near future. And so really thinking about, for all communities, how do you create open space and recreational spaces for youth? There are many communities, like some in south side of Chicago, where kids literally have nowhere safe to go outside and play. And so think about the trajectory of their lives when all they have is nothing outside, and how much you get living somewhere so amazingly open and beautiful where you can go out and play and not be worried about getting shot, for instance. So, there's a lot of low-income areas that just don't have those types of access. And so think about that. And then leverage design and technology. There's so much new technology out there. Earlier this year, I got to go to a 3D printing facility where they're making a house. I may not be there quite mentally, but it was really interesting to see. I hope to go back and see the community that they're developing right outside of Austin. It was actually pretty, so I will say 3D printing has come a long way, but really think about green building technology and all the technology that you have at your hands to think about how we start addressing some of these crises in our city. And then really think about, how do we prioritize transit-oriented development? And certainly people think about it in large cities, but more rural communities, like where both of my parents are from, are starting to think about that and think about transit access, bus, BRT, bikes, walking, whatever it might be. Think about, how do we increase transit-oriented development for all types of mobility? I was sharing with Daniela earlier this year, I had a medical condition, so I had to go through life on a scooter, and it definitely made me think about access and accessibility in a way outside of the book. We were at the APA conference in Minneapolis, and I was using the scooter and going from the host hotel to the convention center. You didn't have to go outside, which was incredibly amazing given it was cold. But there wasn't even a door for me to push the handle, so I could walk a small space. So I would have to get out of my scooter, push the door, and then try to rig it out. And that everybody doesn't have that luxury. So we've got to start thinking about accessibility in a way that a lot of people don't. And I certainly I thought about it theoretically, but not applicably until that time. And we've got to start doing more collaboration. And so it's awesome that you guys have this joint department with both environmental planning and landscape architecture. So you're going to be used to collaborating, but very many of us were in siloed programs. So we go into the profession not thinking about collaborating together. And so the Housing Supply Accelerator was great because we had all the people who weren't usually on the same side of an issue in a room together. And so it was amazing to kind of have some of the tough conversations to produce a document that had a lot of those fights. And then just think about cities aren't just about skyscrapers and commercial development, but it's about creating places for people to both live and thrive. And so think about the cities that you would want to live in today and in the future. So often we think about our current living status, and we've got to go beyond just the 50 years, because as we see, we're still living in zoning codes that are 50 years old in many communities. So really think about the future plan and be futuristic and be bold and be bright and be resilient. And so these are kind of the things I think about. Think about fair housing, think about collaboration, resources. There's plenty of resources out there. There's really nothing new under the sun. Somebody's probably trying something. You guys have it so much easier than in the 90s when I was in school, when you can like just ask AI to tell you. And then really just think about housing and health, and think about how you create communities that allow both housing access, but also are healthy communities. The environmental impacts in so many of our communities, particularly our lower income and minority communities, are still very, very, very much a problem. We are still seeing health disparities in communities of color in most of the country, mostly because of how we've planned it and how we've put housing. And so we've got to be forward thinking and think about how do we really think about the disparate impacts of the decisions from 50 and 100 years ago. And I have faith that your generation will figure it out, where we've kind of just meddled along a little bit in mine. So I look forward to seeing what all of you do. And so as you can see, I'm really into QR codes, and I'd love to hear from you guys. So you can just scan this and you can find me again. I'm pretty easy to find, but I'm really encouraged by spending today and yesterday looking at the work all of you are doing. You guys are doing some great work, as reflected by your student papers and presentations that I got to see. So I have faith that as built environment professionals, the next generation is going to get it right. And you guys are going to fix all the stuff. No pressure, but it's exciting to see such energy and excitement in your projects. And I just want to encourage you to keep going. And I look forward to seeing all of the work you guys will do in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. Does anyone have any questions?
I was like, it's Friday. No one's going to have questions.
I'm wondering about parking, and I guess if you know of any really good examples of what that looks like on kind of like a more neighborhood scale, and how to incorporate that just in a better way.
Yeah, I think a lot of suburban communities went very extreme, particularly in some of the Chicago suburbs, which I actually hate. And so my friend lives in a community where you can't park on the street at all. And so, I'm like, but how do you know your neighbors if you just always are in a garage? And how do you have people over? Like, you have to get special permit to have like Thanksgiving dinner because there's no parking on the street. So that's exactly not what not to do. So I think it's really kind of depends on the community. So I own a car. I'm also a cyclist, but I do also own a car. And so I think about it a lot on what works. And it's hard to say what really works on the community. So it's like really sitting down and talking with the neighbors and figuring out what works. I think what we have to think about too, and I was slow on the parking reductions because I'm so car dependent, even though I live 4 blocks from the train. But there was a building in Chicago that wanted to come in with, it's a 100-unit building, and they wanted 6 parking spots. I was like, that's never going to work. And it was fully leased before they even started construction, even with people knowing there was only 6 parking spots in a neighborhood where people still do, for the most part, have cars. And so it was a good example for me, as someone who does this for a living and talks about it, that it is changing. And so I think what really has to happen is, it's probably not, even in a smaller city, families just aren't buying 2 cars anymore. And so we still are zoning as if they are. And so if we think about in this room of people who are married, very many of them might only be down to 1 car, whereas my parents, we had 3. And so how we do things is just changing. So it's community by community, but I think it's being realistic and looking at how communities are living currently and not how we are, in my mind, how I thought we were living, because that was an eye-opener for me for sure. And I was shocked. And I do drive by there pretty regularly because I was like, whatever, it's just going to be a bunch of cars on the street. And they're right, there aren't a lot of cars on the street around there for people who live there. It's truly just kind of their guess, because I drive by at real times, like real odd times, like 2 in the morning where most people would be home. And there aren't a lot of cars on the street. So that was a good model to show that transit-oriented development in that case is real. And it's also a building for younger folks who tend to not have cars in Chicago, even though I will. I'm not young anymore, so. Anybody else? No?
So obviously there's a lot to learn with this topic. Where do you recommend starting for us as students and aspiring professionals?
On housing, there's so many resources. And I think one of the things that, so I am a housing nerd, so I always kind of research. So the Utah Foundation has some great resources that will be relevant to you specifically here. But the policy guide is a great, so APA has both. This isn't a commercial, this is a real answer. These are actually good ones. So the Zoning for Equity guide is good, but we also have a housing policy guide, which is a good kind of easy way to kind of learn some of the issues that are being addressed around built environment. But, I think one of the good things that I've seen a lot of lately, particularly on the topic of zoning reform, is YIMBYs. I don't know who's funding the YIMBY movement, but like YIMBY Action is providing some pretty good resources around that. They tend to probably be definitely millennials or younger, so it's probably in methods that are easier to read and get through because it's not going to be like big PhD dissertations that maybe an organization might put out, but they have a lot of resources around housing and increasing housing for sure. And I get more emails from them than I do anybody else, so they provide a lot of information, but I am warning, it's a lot of emails. And there's both YIMBY National, but there's state and local chapters as well.
Anyone else? Cam.
So I'm not a planner. I'm studying landscape architecture. We've been doing projects in our classes that, maybe we want to put in smaller homes or certain things that aren't like legal to build, or put this many parking spots in the site and it's not legal to build. How, as designers, can we sort of involve planners in that phasing and sort of advocate for change without having a planning background?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. And I often tell people that planning adjacent folks probably, well, first of all, there's so many landscape architects now that are planners, like at least 2 or 3 of the planning directors of the top major cities are landscape architects. So depending on how you look at it, you probably are a planner. But I would say, as you're coming up with your plans, include them in it. But I think as citizens, regardless of where you work, you are a citizen planner. And so I encourage people to participate in the process. Throw out zoning board hearings. Nobody should come to those. But planning commission meetings where a lot of those decisions, or community meetings where they're discussing, show up and use your professional expertise. So often it's a siloed type of experiment often when you're working in a city, and so they may not even think about it. And so it's important to participate as a professional in those community meetings. And you're in a department with you're probably going to end up working with some classmates in the future that were on the environmental planning side, and so you'll know somebody and just call them up. But I do think it's important for built environment professionals to participate in their local processes when zoning codes are up, when and advocate for them. If they're not proposing them, you suggest them. And sometimes the expert isn't always the person on staff. It's often the community person that's either living it or designing it. And so you're going to have a bulk of information based off of your studies, and you will have designed it, and you can help. You're a resource because most people are visual. And so when they come to those hearings, they're just saying, we don't want parking, and you can show them what it can look like. And I think that's the most helpful tool, and that's the value that you bring to that. And I encourage you to use that.
Other questions? Tom.
Thanks for your fantastic talk. So a lot of things you're talking about are outside the normal stream of profit motives. So a lot of these people are going to be going and working for firms where they're trying to essentially get projects built and raise profit. What skills are necessary to accomplish things outside a normal profit motive?
Yeah, Of course, somebody would ask that. You know, one thing I will say is affordable housing is actually quite lucrative, because I was just at Affordable Housing Live conference earlier this week and somebody drove up in a Maserati. So please don't ever think that there's not money to be made in affordable housing, because developer fee is a developer fee. But I do think there is, when we start talking about profit models, particularly for designers in particular, you know, I think that's why a lot of the affordable housing that I specifically advocate for is integrated it into market rate. And so when you start thinking about it from a real estate development perspective, particularly, a lot of the work that I did when I was still at Chicago Housing Authority is I worked with market rate developers. The city incentivized affordable housing ordinances. So you've got, you know, density bonus if you included 20% affordable housing units. So that's a lot of the work that I do advocacy for now, is incorporating it into the market rate. And it's not necessarily saying the market rate is subsidizing the affordable, because there are funds that can pay for the affordable units to make it doable, but it is an easier, more palatable model to incorporate that into it. And you know, the right thing to do doesn't go very far with folks, but a lot of banks have Community Reinvestment Act requirements, so you do get a lot of lenders who will do funding to incorporate affordable housing into some of the deals. And so that's one of the ways, which does put the onus sometimes. It's been amazing to see how many architects I know who have converted into developers. And I think a lot of that is because they had to start selling some of these types of things. And so it, Focus Development in Chicago, which is one of the more market rate developers, their CEO, I was talking to him, and, you know, a lot of developers, you think of MBAs. He's like, nope, I was a landscape architect. And he said he got in development because he was doing the designs and he was having to do so much conversation around it. He was like, I'm going to go learn development. And I'm going to guess he had some family money, because it's really, he does really sexy stuff, and, you know, that had to start from somewhere. But yeah, it's been really cool. But it is a realistic thing that, you know, sometimes to advocate for things, you do have to think not just outside of the box, but you have to know the dollars and the cents, and you have to make it make sense. And so a lot of the advocacy work I do does require digging into the numbers and making the case for how you can still make money and do some of these things. And I think the tiny home movement that's starting to pick up a lot of traction is starting to show a lot of financial models that people can pull from. And I'm sure in the next couple of years, there will be more and more case studies where those are starting to really pencil out and be profitable for folks.
Anyone else? I'm curious. Thinking about parking, you know, that 2 billion number that we have for amount of parking stalls versus the population in the US. Do you know of any projects where we've taken that parking away and it's really been a success story? I know you mentioned the new complex that wasn't building very much, but I can imagine a lot of people would probably get mad if a parking area got removed from an area. So I'm curious if you know of any projects related to that.
I'm starting to notice them, and it's just because I live in Chicago that I can cite them more, but we're starting to see areas, and it actually is kind of annoying to me, in the South Loop area of Chicago. So if you've ever been to Chicago, it's the area right by the convention center. A lot of what used to be parking lots are becoming housing. And as somebody who has friends over there, it's harder and harder for me to find my car to park there. But so we're starting to see people really assessing, to your point about economics, a lot of property owners, particularly multifamily, are assessing their parking, because if they can build housing, they're going to make more money from that. And so that's where we're really starting to see it, not necessarily a jurisdiction taking away, but property owners, particularly for multifamily, assessing their parking needs versus their housing needs, because it's, you know, you can get $1,500 a month, or in some areas of Chicago where you have to pay for parking, they're getting $200 per unit or for a parking spot. So they're doing the numbers themselves. So we're starting to see, in a capitalistic society, we're starting to see the market assess the parking goals. So that's where I'm seeing it more on a voluntary basis. I'm sure there are areas where they're kind of changing the zoning, but not taking it away, but they're allowing people to do it more so than making them. So